Oregon football has one of the most talented rosters in the country, certainly in the Pac-12. But these players have the most to prove in 2023. And we're back like we never left. Oregon fans, what's going on? How we living? Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the Ducks Dish podcast, your premier podcast for all things Oregon football and recruiting. Just in case you're new here, I'm your host, Max Torres, publisher and lead editor of Ducks Digest, covering the Oregon Ducks over on Fan Nation, part of the Sports Illustrated Network. Couple of quick items before we get into today's episode. Do me a quick favor. I ask you guys every time, but I got to hit the like and subscribe buttons if you're watching here on YouTube. Also, go ahead and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on future episodes, future live streams, future uploads, all that good stuff. Really appreciate all the support that we've been getting lately as we continue to ramp up the podcast, and then do all those same things on your podcasting platform of choice. So, it is Thursday, August 24th, 2023, and Oregon football is one day closer yet again. So, the title of today's episode, Oregon players with the most to prove in 2023. Let's set a little bit of ground rules here. When I say that a player has a lot to prove, it's not because they're bad. It's not because they've underdelivered necessarily. Maybe it is in some cases. But I just think that there's a lot of guys on this team that are capable of greatness. Some of them have already delivered on that. Some of them haven't delivered on that. So I think that there's a lot of storylines around this team, different storylines around different players. So I just wanted to go ahead and make sure I mentioned that. Also, a quick side note for you guys watching me on YouTube, I have my blinds closed here on the side of me. It's my left, maybe your right. But I'm going to try to get like some kind of a curtain just to block that out and hopefully improve the video quality. So apologies on that one, but appreciate you guys sticking with me on it. So which Oregon players have the most to prove in 2023? Let's start. This one might be a little bit of a shocker. We're starting with quarterback Bo Nix. That's right. The face of Oregon's team in 2023 is one of the guys that I think has the most to prove. You might be sitting there wondering, Max, what does Bo Nix have to prove to you? Look what he did in 2022. He lit the pack on fire, took the country by storm. He was one of the best passers in the country, throwing for 3,593 yards, 29 touchdowns against just 7 interceptions. He completed more than 70 of his passes. How can you say he has the most to prove in 2023? Well, all those stats, all those numbers are great. Bo Nix getting the billboards. I talked about that on last night's episode, or yesterday's episode, I guess, of the podcast with Ryan Winter. Go check that one out. Basically, the reason I think that Bo Nix is one of the guys on this Oregon roster that has the most to prove, he needs to do it again. That's the thing. He came over from Auburn, resurrected his college career, was one of the best players in the country last year. But some people were still skeptical of him. Maybe they're saying, oh, he only did that because he got to reunite with Kenny Dillingham, who worked with him at Auburn the last time that he had a really good season. Or maybe he's only doing it because they had a great old line. But Bo Nix kept a lot of plays alive last year with his legs, really good at improvising, keeping his eyes down the field. He was definitely that general that the Oregon offense needed. But now he's working with Will Stein, who comes over from UTSA. Bo looked good in the spring game, and there's definitely a lot of pressure on him. But look at this one from an NFL standpoint. I think it's more or less a given. Bo Nix is a great college quarterback, but how does his game translate to the NFL? This year, it's all about passing for Bo Nix. It's about threading the needle with tight throws, fitting the ball into some tight windows. Bo is probably the best running quarterback in college football, I would say, heading into 2023. But where you still need to see some of that evolution, some of that development, is in the passing game, because the NFL is a passing league. Sure, there's more quarterbacks that are running the ball, but I think we can all agree that that's the part of his game that needs to evolve, needs to take that next step. It's already pretty good, But like Dan Lanning has said, all offseason needs to go from good to great. So Bo Nix is one of those great players, the best player on this Oregon team as of right now. But he needs to prove that 2022 wasn't just a one-off. Bo Nix needs to show up and say, hey, that was great. Watch me do it again. I'm thinking about that SpongeBob meme when he has that speed. Want to see me do it again? Maybe there's not too many SpongeBob viewers out there in the audience, but case in point, Bo Nix needs to do it again. Certainly if he wants to help Oregon get back to the playoff for the first time since 2014, and certainly if he wants to raise his draft stock heading into 2023. So Bo Nix starts things off. I have about 10 players that I'm going to get through. We're going to start on the offensive side of the ball, and then on the back half, we're going to do some defense. So with that being said, number 2 on the list, we have wide receiver Troy Franklin. What's the deal with Troy Franklin? Well, he enters 2023 as the face of the Oregon wide receiver unit. This dude was on an absolute tear in 2022, played in all 13 games, hauled in 61 catches for 891 yards and 9 touchdowns to pace the Ducks, led the team, averaged 14.61 yards per catch. And it's a little bit of a similar deal with Bo Nix for Troy Franklin. He had a great year last year. How does he improve from that? What's the next step in his game? Oregon hasn't had a 1,000-yard receiver since Dylan Mitchell, which I think was back in 2018. And a lot of people think that Troy Franklin's going to be the guy that can get it done. Troy Franklin also has something to prove because he landed on the Biletnikoff Award preseason watch list, which is given annually to the best wide receiver in college football. And Troy Franklin, he wants to show, hey, I belong in that discussion. I am one of the best wide receivers in college football. I saw a post from a fan the other day on Instagram that had some highlights of Troy Franklin, and it said Biletnikoff season loading. Troy Franklin has the ability to do that. He has an awesome quarterback in Bo Nix, and what might even help him, he has a loaded wide receiver room to work with. He has Trayshawn Holden. He has Gary Bryant. He has Tez Johnson. There's a plenty of other guys that these opposing defensive coordinators are going to have to worry about if they want to slow this Oregon offense down. Troy Franklin is certainly the focal point of the passing attack, but you also have Terrence Ferguson at that tight end spot, so I think he factors in there as well. Troy Franklin is an absolute stud, but I still think that he has something to prove because 2022 was our first real glance of Troy Franklin, if we're being honest with ourselves. Sure, he saw a pretty good amount of playing time as a true freshman in 2021, but that was under Mario Cristobal, who really doesn't like to pass the ball too much, certainly didn't like to pass the ball very much at Oregon. And granted, Oregon was pretty limited at quarterback with Anthony Brown as well. So 2022 was our first true glimpse of Troy Franklin. Now it's on him to deliver and follow up on that great campaign with a strong 2023 showing. The next guy on our list, let's stay in that wide receiver room, Tez Johnson. Tez Johnson, I think he has something to prove because he caught a lot of attention in the spring game with that long catch and run touchdown. I think it was like 70 yards. But I think there's some skepticism around his game because he's not a big dude. 5'10", I think is what he's listed at, and then 160 pounds. So he certainly has a slight frame that he's working with, but he was one of the highest rated and graded wide receivers in all of college football, according to Pro Football Focus last year. So a lot of people are kind of hanging on to that achievement. And I guess I'm doing a little bit of it now, but I'm saying that he needs to show that he can play at this level of college football. I certainly think he can, but I think he needs to send that message to the rest of the country. Hey, who's that wide receiver? Where was he at? He was at Troy. Oh, now he's playing like he belongs at Oregon. And we all know about the story with him and Bo Nix, his adopted brother, that connection. They have that great chemistry from their days playing together out in Pinson, Alabama. So I think Tez Johnson, he's the speedster guy, the explosive play guy, kind of lightning in a bottle type of deal. I feel like that's kind of what he's being billed as for Oregon's offense here early on. And I think he's somebody who certainly carries some high expectations going into 2023. This is, like I said, a loaded wide receiver room, but I think that the expectations are pretty high for Tez Johnson to deliver, and it's looking like he's going to be able to live up to the hype. You also have to see how is his body going to hold up this season, and what does that rotation look like at the wide receiver spot. How much of Tez Johnson are we going to see versus Chris Hudson, who's a pretty solid piece in that wide receiver room? But you kind of wonder, has Chris Hudson done enough to ultimately hold off Tez Johnson? We've seen it time and time again. I just talked about it with Ryan Winter on his show. Guys don't come out of the transfer portal to sit. You're not transferring to a school unless you feel pretty darn good about your chances of being a contributor and a regular piece in that rotation. So Tez Johnson, I think he's super promising guy that I'm super excited about. He's definitely got the juice at wide receiver, and Junior Adams is going to help get him right. But I think he's a guy that definitely has the most to prove in 2023. A couple more guys on offense. Let's talk about Josh Conerly. Josh Conerly Jr. is a guy that came to Oregon with quite the track record, at least as a highly touted recruit, incredibly sought after out of Seattle, Washington, Rainier Beach High School. One of the things that you have to look at with Josh Conerly, he was a 5-star recruit. He is, let's see, I'm looking at the 247 page right now. Josh Conerly is the 8th highest recruit to ever commit to Oregon, ever. And he is the highest rated lineman to ever commit to Oregon, offensive lineman. And you have to look at Penei Sewell as a guy who was in that conversation. He developed into a first-round draft pick. He was a guy who played left tackle and protected Herbert's blindside when he was at Oregon. Josh Conerly is widely viewed as the runaway favorite to win that starting left tackle spot that was previously held down by TJ Bass last year. And he's a true sophomore. But fortunately for the Ducks, this guy played a lot of ball last year. But you have to say here, he wasn't a starter, on the regular, wasn't an every down kind of guy, right? He was in on that 13J formation with Jordan James, kind of their jumbo package. This is a guy who is as athletic of an offensive lineman as you'll find anywhere in the country. Heck, he even caught a touchdown on his birthday against Colorado. Alik Terry has praised him as one of the hardest workers in that offensive line room, incredibly athletic. Conerly also played basketball in high school for Rainier Beach. So this is a guy who really has hit the ground running in Eugene. And I think that he has a lot of expectations for 2023. Having a true sophomore blocking for Bo Nix, protecting Bo Nix's blindside, I think that that's obviously a duty that Oregon doesn't take lightly, and I'm sure Josh Conerly doesn't take lightly. But all of that said, he enters this 2023 season needing to prove, hey, I'm that guy. I mean, Josh Conerly, we've talked to him. He's pretty soft-spoken. Certainly not a guy that comes across as self-absorbed or cocky, but it's part of what we have going into the season. He needs to send that message. I'm that guy. I'm every bit of the hype that people have been putting around me. He's never going to say that, but that's what his play on the field is going to say. So Josh Conerly Jr., he's really, I think, kind of the cornerstone of the offensive line as far as just continuing to prove that Oregon is still a destination for elite offensive linemen, and that's not going to go away anytime soon. But that left tackle spot is easily one of the most important spots on your entire offensive line. I'm thinking about the blindside and Lawrence Taylor. Blindside's been in the news lately with all that crazy stuff going on. So we don't need to get too sidetracked. But Josh Conerly Jr., he's got a lot to prove in 2023, and I think he's going to be able to do it. A couple more names on offense. How about tight end Patrick Herbert? Patrick Herbert, P. Herbo. So much time at Oregon, but he really hasn't been able to see the field too much. Is a career that's been plagued by injuries for a long time. But hey, 2022 wasn't necessarily a breakout year for Patrick Herbert, but he stayed healthy, which I think was a tremendous victory for him, his family, Drew Maringer, certainly, that tight end room. We're still trying to see what Stein's offense is ultimately going to look like. Are we going to be able to see 4 tight ends like we did last year? It kind of remains to be seen. But I think that Terrence Ferguson and Patrick Herbert are obviously going to be the faces of the tight end room, a room that is flanked by Casey Kelly, the Ole Miss tight end transfer, Caden Ludwig, who transferred from Colorado, and then Kenyon Sadiq, the true freshman out of Idaho. But Patrick Herbert, I think he's probably ready to make his own name for himself. He probably, I mean, this guy, when you see him get asked, he was getting asked questions about his brother Justin in the draft, and then after, when he's just killing it in the NFL. If I were him, I would be kind of over getting asked about my brother all the time. So I bet he wants to go out in 2023 and make a statement and say, hey, you need to talk more about that younger Herbert brother, because unlike his brother Justin, Patrick Herbert was a four-star recruit. He was a national name. So he probably wants to show, hey, I got some game. And I think that he wants to probably hit the next step in his game to be someone who can affect the passing game to a similar degree that Terrence Ferguson can, because I think he's kind of been cast in this light as a blocker. And Oregon's going to need him to be a guy who can be a threat in the receiving game, because they're going to key in. Defenses are going to key in on Terrence Ferguson and Troy Franklin. So if Patrick Herbert can take that next step in his game, I think he's going to make this Oregon offense even more lethal than it already is. All right, the last name that we're going to be talking about on the offensive side for Ducks with the most to prove in 2023, let's talk about Jordan James. Jordan James is a true sophomore as well, similar to Josh Connerly. This is a guy who played a lot of ball right out of the gate. Played in 10 games for the Ducks, had 46 carries, 194 yards, 189 yards net, averaged 4 yards a pop, and scored 5 touchdowns. So didn't have a crazy true freshman campaign, but he played a pretty significant role for the Ducks. He was their primary third down back, their primary short yardage, goal line back, and Carlos Loughlin said that even that was a significant role, but the hype around Jordan James in fall camp has been real. And some of the people that I've been talking to around the program have backed up that hype. And what does a bigger role look like for Jordan James in 2023? I think that still remains to be seen, but we've seen that running back room kind of function in a 1A, 1B capacity with Bucky Irving and Noah Whittington. Maybe it's a 1A, 1B, 1C. Maybe the Ducks rotate 3 backs this season. And Jordan James is a unique guy. He's a big dude at 6'2", about 210 pounds, I believe. Let me go ahead and see if I can pull this up, because I always like to make sure I have that right. Jordan James on the updated 2023 Oregon football roster, 5'10", 205. Still a big back. But this is a guy who was committed to Georgia for a long time. And then Carlos Loughlin got hired and he flipped to Oregon. So this is a guy who has a pretty strong reputation coming out of Tennessee, where they play some pretty darn good football. And I think he's next. He's next in line. And his role is going to be really important this year, because it looks like all signs are pointing to Bucky Irving and Noah Whittington probably heading to the league after 2023. So maybe it's the Jordan James show come 2024. And that room also features Dante Dowdell, who was a highly touted recruit out of Mississippi, and then Jaden Lamar, who was a highly touted recruit out of Washington, previously committed to Notre Dame until the Ducks flipped him late. So Jordan James was one of these guys on the most approved list, because we want to see how he can follow up his true freshman campaign, a year where we didn't really see him featured too prominently in terms of doing a lot of different things. I don't want to say that it's easy to be the short yardage back, but just what does his role look like? How can he evolve out of the backfield? How can he evolve running off the tackles, running some sweeps, as opposed to just, dives and short yardage plays? So Jordan James has been getting raved about for a lot of this offseason, and I think he's the next in line to be a great bell cow back for Oregon after Bucky Irving and Noah Whittington. So I think he is definitely one of those guys that lands on this list to round out our offensive players of Oregon Ducks with the most to prove in 2023. Rolling right along, we have the defensive players at Oregon with the most to prove in 2023. Starting things off, we're going to go ahead and talk about defensive end Jordan Burch. Jordan Burch has been the talk of the Oregon defense this offseason, because Oregon's pass rush last year definitely underdelivered. So what do? They go out into SEC country, go into the SEC to get former South Carolina edge rusher Jordan Burch, who's listed on the updated roster at 6'5", 295 pounds. So certainly a unique build. I got a little bit of construction going on outside, so I'm going to try to talk over that. It hadn't been a problem earlier in the day, so I apologize about that. 6'6", 290 pounds, excuse me, Jordan Birch. But this is the guy who has a lot to prove, because I think a lot of Oregon's defensive success in 2023 kind of rests on his shoulders. How big of a role is he going to be able to play? Is he going to be an unstoppable force? What does he look like in comparison to guys like Kayvon Thibodeau that have previously come through Oregon? Thibodeau was a #1 overall recruit, and he had a lot of success at Oregon. But different body type, right? KT was more 6'5", 6'4", 240, 250 pounds, 6'6", 290 pounds. And Birch even said that he kind of feels comfortable dropping back in coverage. This is the guy who can do a lot of different things. And I want to see not only how can he get after the quarterback, but how does he do stopping the run? If you really want to be a valuable defensive lineman, you can do both. And I think that's an area where Kayvon really grew his game in his final year at Oregon. But you don't want to be a one-trick pony. What is we've heard about this spin move. I know James Crepia asks about the spin move a lot with Jordan Birch during those pressers. So what does his bag look like? What's his pass rushing tool bag look like? What kind of moves does he have? I think he's easily the face of Oregon's transfer portal haul ahead of the 2023 season. So Jordan Birch is absolutely one of those guys who has the most to prove for Oregon in 2023. He's from the state of South Carolina, went to South Carolina, but things didn't ultimately work out. So now in my mind, if I'm Jordan Birch, I want to go prove to everyone, hey, I'll go across the country. I'll go play for Oregon and some of the brightest defensive minds in the game, because I think they can take me to my next level. And that's what we want to see from Jordan Birch in 2023. What does that next level look like? And how much different is it from those other guys that Oregon already has on the roster? Because I think we can probably safely say it looks quite a bit different. So you have Oregon with Jordan Birch, maybe Mace Funa starts on the other end. And then behind him, you got Mateo Uyunglele. Tatum Tuioti is another true freshman that has generated a lot of buzz since enrolling early at Oregon, spent his senior year at Sheldon High School after the Ducks hired his dad, Tony Tuioti, to coach the defensive line. But Jordan Birch is my Oregon defensive player with the most to prove in 2023. Moving right along, let's go back into the secondary. I think the secondary is a really interesting group to analyze, because we have a lot of guys that have played a lot of ball and a lot of new guys who we haven't really seen too much of. And we don't know how this group is going to gel, but I'm going to go with Dante Manning. Why do I talk about cornerback Dante Manning? Well, for starters, this is the highest rated corner that Oregon has ever signed. Dante Manning was an All-American caliber player in the 2020 class out of Missouri, Kansas City area. And what was all the buzz with Dante coming in? You know, super athletic, crazy fast, twitchy. This is a guy who ran track in high school, but he's been a little bit injured, and we really haven't seen him kind of take that next step. I think for me, we saw him look more comfortable in 2022, but we ultimately want to see him be a guy. We need Oregon corners to really solidify themselves as assets in that secondary, playmakers, lockdown guys, something like that. And we haven't really seen that from Dante Manning. And he's a guy who's trying to still live up to that reputation. I mean, it probably doesn't mean a whole lot to him, but kind of like what I'm saying, he was one of those people coming out of high school, one of those players that was the guy. A lot of these highly rated guys are the guys at their respective schools, but for a position like corner, when you lose Christian Gonzalez from a year ago, they need some dominant forces to stand out in that room. And I think Dante Manning is a guy who's capable of it, but we really haven't seen too much of it. So Dante Manning is a guy that I think definitely has a lot to prove. And he was able to stay healthy last year and was heavily involved, heavily in that rotation in the cornerback room. And I think he's someone that has quite a bit to prove still in 2023. Also in the cornerback room, we got to talk about Triquez Bridges. Triquez Bridges, I think, is getting more comfortable in this cornerback spot. He came to Oregon as a safety. and then transition to corner. But I think the discussion is pretty much over. This isn't a guy that's going to bounce around in that secondary. I think he is locked in at the cornerback spot. But that said, we still haven't really seen that next level from Triquez Bridges. I think it's kind of like you know what you have from him, but at the same time, he's a lengthy guy. He has a great frame for the position, 6'3", 198. He was a pick machine in high school, but we just haven't seen a whole lot of it. He did land on the Pro Football Focus All Pac-12 third team last year, so he started 13 games in his fourth year with the Ducks, but we still just haven't seen that production too much. He did have 3 interceptions last year, so I think he's heading in the right direction. Maybe I need to walk that back a little bit about not seeing the production, but he had 3 picks last year and 8 passes defended, had 30 solo tackles, 49 total tackles and 1 TFL. But Dan Lanning's defense has really been set up for, those long, tall, speedy corners. And I think that Triquez Bridges should be a guy that fits that mold really well. But what is the next level? Similar to Jordan Burch, what is the next level of his game? So he's been at Oregon for 4 years now. He should be comfortable. He only played in 1 game as a true freshman, then 7 in 2020, and then 14 and 13. So he has plenty of reps under his belt as a corner. So now it's time for him to really settle in, time for him to lock in. And I think he's more than capable of finding that next gear and being a regular contributor for Oregon in the secondary in that cornerback room. But all that said, look at the guys that Oregon brought in at his position. I think that sends a message. 2 transfer portal guys. Nico Reed previously played for Demetrius Martin at Colorado. Pretty good production out in Boulder. And Kyrie Jackson, 6'3" corner out of Alabama. So he knows what elite football looks like. Both of those guys come in, and they're probably going to have pretty strong roles, pretty large roles in Oregon's defense come 2023. So those guys are kind of nipping at their heels. I don't feel like anybody in that cornerback room has a job that's locked down. And you could probably say the same thing about the safeties. I'll get a little bit more into that later. And then we have to talk about Jaleel Florence. Jaleel Florence was a stud of a recruit coming out of San Diego Lincoln High School, where I was at recently, home to 2025 Oregon quarterback commit Achilles Smith Jr. Jaleel Florence, 4-star guy, 157 player nationally in 2022, played a pretty good amount of ball last year for the Ducks, even as a true freshman. So what's the story with him? Well, he's another tall, fast defensive back, 6'1", 193 pounds, played in 8 of 13 games for Oregon as a true freshman, finished with 8 total tackles, 1 tackle for loss, had an interception against Arizona, I believe, and a forced fumble. He was one of just 2 true freshmen in the Pac-12 to record an interception and played 208 defensive snaps. So he's really looking experienced. I think he's definitely one of those guys that could be poised to take a leap from his true freshman to his true sophomore season. And he's just been solid. I think that obviously he had some moments of growth. I remember that Dante Thornton got a touchdown against him in that spring game. So he probably took that season and just kind of wants to run with it. I think that that's important. All right, we're back. I had a little bit of construction continue, but we're towards the back end of the pod, I think. Tried to close the window the best I could, but you guys might still hear it. But Jaleel Florence played a lot of ball, and I think that he's shown some signs of promise, and I think that he's someone who should definitely be in consideration to have a significant role in this secondary for the Ducks in 2023. So I hit on a lot of guys in that cornerback spot, but they're guys that have been at Oregon and that I think should really be able to find that next step in their game and see what they can bring. Like I said, they brought in a lot of players, but I think that those guys probably want to come together and say, hey, look at what you already had on the roster. Look at the ball that we can play. Not that there's any drama or anything. I'm not trying to spin that off. But I think that they're definitely going to be key factors in this defense next year. Next, we're talking about the linebackers. Again, I think there's a lot of guys in this room that have a lot to prove, but Jeffrey Bassa has to be one of them for me. I was watching some film from last year. You guys know the story. He wasn't really well graded by PFF. He was kind of getting ran over and thrown around on more occasions than he probably wanted to for Oregon's defense last year. And now he hits the weight room in his offseason, and he's bulked up to right around 230. So now it's time for him to show that he can go and play at that weight, that he can be a contributor at linebacker, be a leader at the position. So he's been at linebacker for a couple years now. He's comfortable, and I think he probably fits a bit more of that Dan Lanning linebacker that you're looking for, a guy who's athletic, a guy who can run, and then hopefully, for Oregon's sake, a guy who can cover. So definitely throw in Jeffrey Bassa as a guy who has a lot to prove for the Ducks here in 2023. Then we look to the portal and we stay at the linebacker position. Justin Jacobs comes in from Iowa, and really, I think that he has something to prove because we didn't see a whole lot of him last year. He got banged up. That cut his season short. And then he comes over to Oregon, and it looks like he is on track to be one of the better linebackers in this conference. We know that Iowa's offense was awful last year, but that's okay because Iowa is known for having a really good defense and having some good linebackers. Justin Jacobs, 6'4", around 240 pounds. This is a physical linebacker and a very athletic guy who I think can do a little bit of everything. He was really sought after in the portal for his ability to cover in the passing game, and then he can also provide some added value as a pass rusher. So I think that he definitely is a guy who Oregon's looking at. Oregon fans are probably looking at, like, can he bounce back from his injury? Can he lead this linebacker group as one of the most experienced guys in that room? Can he be that player, that dog that everybody is so high on? I think that the secondary, this defense really, in my opinion, you guys, this defense, the only known commodity that we really have is the defensive line, because you have a bunch of new linebackers and you have a bunch of new DBs. So I think that Justin Jacobs is there in that conversation about guys with a lot to prove. Also, Connor Soley, who comes over from Arizona State. I think he's kind of a less talked about name, maybe not super sought after in the transfer portal, but certainly has that great work ethic. And some of the people that I've talked to in Eugene say that he's as advertised and that it's working out well for him. But we're really going to have to see how this linebacker hierarchy, how this depth chart rather works out, because I think it's probably going to be Justin Jacobs and Jeffrey Bassa, and then some combination of Connor Soley and maybe Jamal Hill. And Jamal Hill is another guy that I have on a guy with the most to prove at Oregon this year. Why is that? Well, he came to Oregon in 2019 and saw a decent amount of action, and he got on a lot of people's radar in after that Pac-12 title game against USC, where he snagged not one but 2 interceptions. But every time I talk about Jamal Hill, that's like the same thing that I'm saying all the time. And when he was in coverage last year, at times he was pretty solid, but you saw him get burnt a little bit here and there. So you kind of wondered, is he fast enough to be a contributor and be a difference maker in the secondary? Maybe not. So this Oregon coaching staff decided to try him at linebacker, and he bulked up this offseason too. So I'm always getting excited about these former safeties that convert to linebackers because they can usually move pretty freaking well. And I think that's definitely what Jamal Hill is on track for. We have to see what he ultimately looks like at the position. I know he made a really good tackle in space on Bucky Irving in that spring game, but he's been at Oregon for a long time, and he's still hasn't really made a name for himself too much, hasn't carved out too big of a role. So throw Jamal Hill on that list as well as Oregon players with the most to prove in 2023. My last guy on defense with the most to prove for Oregon in 2023, let's talk about Brian Addison, BA. He is someone I'm pretty stoked about. He was probably the most productive safety that the Ducks had in 2022. And he's played a lot of ball for the Ducks. And what's interesting with him, he's huge. 6'5", 198 pounds. Brian Addison, former UCLA signee, came to Oregon, started as a wide receiver because he was recruited as an athlete. Started as a wide receiver, didn't do a whole lot. But in 2021, he moved to defensive back and kind of carved out a little role for himself. In 2022, he only made one start, but he played in 12 of Oregon's 13 games, had 30 total tackles, 19 solo, and then he also had some production, 2 interceptions, 1 forced fumble, and 5 pass breakups. That's pretty good for me. It's just, what's the next level of his game? I think he has such a unique frame. There's not too many times you see a lot of 6'5" safeties, a lot of guys that can move like Brian Addison can. So this secondary, this safety room, where does Brian Addison stack up with some of these other guys? Steve Stevens, been around for a while, played a lot of ball. Tysheem Johnson comes in from Ole Miss and has been moving all around the secondary, and everyone's raving about him. Evan Williams, hard-hitting brother of Bennett Williams, former Duck. He comes over from Fresno State after being one of the better safeties, one of the better playmaking defensive backs in the Mountain West. What does he look like? What is his role like? He's talking about how he wants the Oregon defense to be feared. I think that those guys, Evan Williams and Bennett and Tysheem Johnson, are guys that are going to have big roles in this defense. So I think more so than any other group, I was going to say the cornerbacks, but maybe just the secondary as a whole. I think Dan Lanning's been talking about going from good to great all offseason. On this defense, maybe even on this team, I think Oregon's secondary is the group that needs to go from good to great the most, and they have the talent to do it. I think a lot of the criticism, or a lot of the flack that Oregon's secondary got last year wasn't entirely their fault. Like I talked about earlier, Oregon's defensive line, especially just the pass rushing component of this defense, not great, pretty bad. I mean, they did generate pressure. Don't get me wrong, but pressure only helps if you finish the play, if you bring the quarterback down, if you bring down the ball carrier for loss. So that was part of the problem here, is that Oregon got some pressure here and there, or maybe even more often than we're giving them credit for, but the quarterback, he was able to scramble out. He was able to extend plays, keep his eyes down the field. And that just gave the receivers more time to operate and put more pressure on the DBs to hold their coverage and try to stick to those guys, which is tough to do. So if Oregon's defensive line, if their pass rush specifically improves, if Jordan Burch can live up to that billing, that hype, then you should see the secondary take a leap along with them. But Brian Addison is a guy I'm really excited about. I think he probably has the best case to continue getting snaps in that safety room from the guys a year ago. Oregon lost Bennett Williams. Steve Stevens has played a lot of ball, but I just don't know if he's done enough to stay on the field and solidify himself as one of those guys who you just have to have on the field because he's a difference maker. But Tysheem Johnson, he's a former SEC guy. You don't want to say, oh, he should get the starting job just because he was an SEC guy. But he went to the SEC for a reason. And I think he could end up being one of those guys that you're saying, whoa, we got him from Ole Miss. Like, Oregon typically, at least lately, has been on the losing end of some of these SEC recruiting battles. Transfer portal, that's your second chance. That's your second chance, man. That's when you can go out and get some of these guys that Oregon hasn't been able to get in the past. So Tysheem Johnson, he's a guy I'm super excited about. Him, Evan Williams, Brian Addison, maybe you see some Nico Reed at nickel, some Cole Martin at nickel. Everyone is moving around everywhere in this secondary, so it is one huge question mark. We just don't know who's going to be where necessarily, and we don't know what they're going to look like, what the combinations are going to look like. It's just it's a waiting game for right now. But Brian Addison rounds out that list, and I think he will wrap up our episode of the Ducks Dish podcast. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to another episode. Make sure you lock in with me on social media. I am at Torres Sports on both Twitter and Instagram. You can, of course, find me on YouTube at Oregon Football Max Torres. Please do me a favor and subscribe to the channel and like the video. It's a big help with the algorithm. Share the Ducks Dish podcast with your friends, with your family, and with other Duck fans. And make sure that you find all of my written work covering Dan Lanning, Oregon football, Oregon recruiting over on ducksdigest.com. But until the next time, until the next episode, appreciate you guys for tuning in. And thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Ducks Dish podcast.